So we come to Amos chapter 7 and 3 verses in chapter 8 tonight. And we are going to take a look at a chapter that I think is fairly easy for once to get our arms around. And I'll show you the outline again that we've been using. We are down here into chapter 7, where there's some visions of divine judgment that is coming. And there are 4 visions that are in this section, a vision of locusts, a vision of fire, a vision of a plumb line, and a vision of ripe fruit. But right after vision number 3, there's a narrative interlude, and it's a setup between Amos the prophet and Amaziah the priest. So the 4 visions that make up chapter 7 and the first part of chapter 8 is interrupted. And these visions are warnings of the coming judgment that God is going to allow happen through foreign powers upon his people. And the way this is communicated is kind of interesting. And sometimes you have to ask the question in these visions, what is literal and what is symbolic? And I think the first vision is where we ask that question initially. This plague of locusts, is that talking about a literal plague, or is it representative of a foreign power that is coming in and taking over the land? So in the book of Amos, one of the things that you kind of have to do is remember a little bit of the covenant language that you have found all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy. And I'm not sure when the last time any of us have read the book of Deuteronomy. However, in chapters 28 through 32, you have a listing of both the blessings and cursings that God warns the people of should they break the covenant. And in chapter 7 here, in the first couple of visions, you'll find that Amos intercedes on behalf of his people, and God is seen as relenting from what he is predicting. And then the final couple of visions, there's no intervention. And as a result, there is judgment that is irrevertible. And so when you look at these, kind of ask yourself, what could this be representative of? So let's talk about in verses 1 and 2 here. This first vision is of a swarm of locusts. It says in verse 1, "This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops were coming up. When they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, 'Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small.'" So let's kind of divide this up a little bit and take a look at the parts of it. When you look at the swarm of locusts, this is language that comes all the way back from the book of Deuteronomy. And when you read the book of Deuteronomy, you'll find in this second giving of the law that there is a series of blessings and curses based upon either the obedience or disobedience of the people. And when you come to Deuteronomy 28, you get to verse 28, or 42 rather, and you see where this imagery of locusts comes from. It says, beginning in verse 38 of Deuteronomy 28, "You will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little because locusts will devour it. You will plant vineyards and cultivate them, but you will not drink the wine or gather the grapes because worms will eat them. You have you will have olive trees throughout your country, but you will not use the oil because the olives will drop off. Will have sons and daughters, but you will not keep them because they will go into captivity. Swarms of locusts will take over all your trees and crops of your land. So in Deuteronomy 28, it seems as though the warning is pretty literal, that somehow these locusts are building on the type of plagues that we saw in the book of Exodus when the people were being delivered out of Egypt. Here we find in a repetition of the law that the warning is that plagues, such as those that were in Exodus, might have its object in the people of God. So, in these curses that are mentioned in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, the condition is this. Back in verse 15 of that chapter, it says, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. Then that whole chapter begins to list those. Now, what's interesting to me, let's go back to Amos, is the way this verse kind of breaks down. Um, and this is what makes me question whether this is a literal plague of locusts. And I don't know if you noticed this when I read this. It says he was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share. Now that's interesting. After the king's share, what is that? Well, the king's share was the first cut of the harvest that the king will take, and you would use the tax as tribute to his empire. And in that way, it seems as though you're going to have crops enough for the king to benefit from it, but you won't, which means that who is this going to be the object of if the king has taken his share, either in terms of monetary gain or if he kept the food itself? The economic crisis after a locust plague would be food insecurity for the poor primarily. Those in the palace and court might have been okay. It says here, after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops are coming up. So, if this is a literal plague of locusts, it seems to hit late in the harvest season, which then would be most destructive to people that were gleaning for themselves rather than for the king. So this makes me wonder whether or not this might be related to the idea of the swarm of locusts being other nations that are going to invade them and kind of strip their economic prosperity away from them. I don't know. I can't prove that. It's just a question that came up in my mind. But it does say in verse 2, when they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, Sovereign Lord. The vision is pretty simple. The locust is consuming all the vegetation, not isolated crops, which again kind of recalls some of the things that happened during the days of the Exodus. So, what we're finding here is also kind of cross-referenced over in the preceding prophet. The book of Joel talks about locusts as well. And I'll read just a couple of verses out of Joel chapter 1. So here we find the prophet Joel begins with his book with an invasion of locusts. It says in verse 2, hear this, you elders, listen, all you who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children and let your children tell it to their children and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm have left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. It's very rhythmic there. It's very poetic. And then he says, wake up, you drunkards, and weep, and so on and so forth. Then he goes into some other imagery, but he begins with this idea of locusts. And it almost seems the poetic nature in Joel is such that it is a warning that might not necessarily be a literal plague of locusts, but it's this idea of invasion, being overtaken, that type of thing. All you who live in the land, has anything like this, has it ever happened in your day? So whether you take this literally or symbolic, the result is the same, basically. The people are vulnerable. They are unable to survive. And that's where verse 2 comes in. Amos acts as an intercessor here. And what he does, in much like Moses did when he comes down from Mount Sinai and see that the people had built the golden calves, he intercedes on their behalf, and God spares the nation as a whole. And Amos here kind of takes on the role of an intercessor, and he cries out, "Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small." So Amos intercedes, and the term "he is so small" suggests that Israel can't stand up against these powerful neighbors like Assyria and Babylon and Egypt. But Amos here is kind of acting like Moses. So I'm beginning to think that maybe this is updated Exodus imagery that is being used as a communication tool here against the northern tribes. You'll notice the next thing is stated pretty simply. So the Lord relented. It pictures God as changing his heart. It pictures God not allowing this to happen. The judgment is averted, at least for the time being. And Amos here is seen as the one that is standing in the gap for his people. So this is interesting. God is seen as changing his heart here. And many times when we build big theological systems, and especially if it is built upon a singular attribute of the sovereignty of God, it's almost as if God never, God knows what he wants to do. He always achieves what he wants to do. He never changes his mind. I, the Lord, do not change. And you'll notice here in verse 2, he says sovereign Lord. He uses the term sovereign, but there is a vulnerability here. And God is seen as listening to Amos and having compassion and mercy upon this situation. So, vision number one is the vision of locusts that could lead to some theological points here that might be helpful. The vision is of God who is both just and merciful at the same time. It's a vision of locusts that communicates the severity of Israel's situation. They're in a vulnerable situation, even though they are living in a prosperous time and they're not thinking of the potential danger that is lurking. And then this interplay that is taking place between judgment, compassion, and the intercession of Amos as part of his prophetic ministry as he kind of stands in the breach on behalf of his people. Then that brings us to the second vision. It begins in verse 4. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. Same idea, the way verse 1 began. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the great deep and devoured the land. Then I cried out, Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small. So the Lord relented. This will not happen either, the Lord said. So now the image has changed from locust to fire. But there's a connection here that's important, and it's not to be missed. It dried up the great deep. Well, that's a term that comes from Genesis. The great deep, the cosmic deep, that this fire has the potential, at least symbolically, to consume even the greatest and the biggest and the strongest elements that are found in the created order. And so this idea of a judgment by fire, drying up the great deep, being water and devouring the land. Well, I thought water puts fire out, you know, um, unless you're thinking of Adele's song, I Set Fire to the Rain. But so it's interesting the way this is stated here. This fire, whatever it is, the presence of God, the power of God, is strong enough to dry up even the deepest oceans. So the fire here, I think, is metaphorical, but the devastation is implied. So the fire obviously can symbolize wrath and judgment. Again, going back to Deuteronomy 32 and some other prophets like Isaiah talk about some of that through the same imagery. But I think what it's suggesting is mankind can't hold this back. God's too powerful and overwhelming for man to battle against God. And so, if the cosmic deep here is kind of that primordial chaos that began even before the created order, remember in Genesis 1, God separates the waters and then dry land emerges and so forth. There's some things going on here in this reference that goes all the way back to Genesis. And I think what it's implying primarily is the type of chaos, agriculturally, economic, ecologically, as a symbol of this threat that is coming against the northern tribes. So that is the second vision. So the vision of the locust and the vision of the fire also have intercession in the second here by Amos. It is interesting the term that he uses here, though. Notice in this vision, he says, how can Jacob survive? So in the first one, he says here, how can Jacob survive? Both times it uses the name of one of the patriarchs. And this might be a name that is evoking God's covenantal relationship with the nation of Israel as a whole. So in Genesis chapter 32, where you have this interaction that God is having with the patriarchs, in chapter 32, in verse 28, it says this Jacob is wrestling with God. And that's the passage where this godlike figure shows up and wrestles with Jacob until daybreak. And then it says here that there's a name change that takes place in verse 28. So they wrestle. This, whoever this figure is, touches the hip of Jacob and it's disjointed. And then his name is changed. And the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. This might be a reference to this ongoing battle between God and the nation of Israel. But in this covenant relationship, Jacob, as in Genesis 32, will not let this man go or not let God go. And consequently, I think the implication here is God will not let Israel go either. So the same thing is said by Amos. He's so small, the nation is so small, so the Lord relents. This will not happen either. Again, the mercy of God. So twice God is seen as kind of changing his mind, and then that averts the destructive path of these first two visions. So I think this does kind of raise a theological idea. When we think about God's plans, we think of them as immutable, unchanging. But here, I think it's showing us that God's plans are not mechanical, but it's also responsive and relational. And perhaps this is why prayer comes in to interact on this relational basis, because God is a responsive God. He's not just a divine monarch that does what he wants regardless. So, interesting first two visions here that take place. Now, what you have is a third vision. This one is different. This one is the vision of a plumb line. Now, a plumb line is to show if something is plumb in terms of being straight. So, plumbers will often use a plumb line, heavier item on a string, and hold it up to see if something is true. That's kind of what is, I'm not sure it's a string or that type of plumb that is being referred to, but it is some type of way of evaluating whether something is in alignment or not. So, whether it's a mason's tool that's in mind here, I'm not quite sure. But it begins in verse 7. This is what, well, it begins in verse 6. So the Lord relented. This will not happen either, the Lord said. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb, with a plumb line in his hand. So it's using some type of vertical device to see whether it's straight or not. And the Lord asked me, "What do you see, Amos?" "A plumb line," I replied. Then the Lord said, "Look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel, and I will not spare them. I will spare them no longer." Now, this time, God's not going to change his mind. So he's holding up this plumb line. And what is the wall that he's holding the plumb line against? I think it's the standards laid out in the covenant that he made with his people. And that's not just the Ten Commandments, that's the entire covenant that is inclusive of parts of Exodus, Leviticus, and certainly the repetition of Deuteronomy as well. So God is measuring his people against the standards of this covenant, of which a lot of these standards relate to injustice, because that's where this is going to go into chapter 8. It's eventually going to turn to the injustice that is happening, and we'll get to that next week. So Israel's being judged by God's standard, not by comparison to other nations. So a lot of times what happens is, well, we're not as bad as this nation or that nation, so we're better off. And God is saying, no, I'm judging you according to my standards here. And this is the only place this plumb line word is used. It's a Hebrew word, anak, and it's only used here in all the Old Testament. And so it's this idea of, is this built to the standard? Will it uphold? Will it have integrity? So a wall that's not built to standard, maybe if it's not plumb, think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It could fall over. It could be damaged. It could be dangerous. In fact, so this vision here, using the plumb line, is significant. Now, in the next verse, verse 9, you see three targets of the judgment. It says here, the high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. With my sword I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. The name Isaac seems to represent all of Israel here. The high places are those false altars, those pagan altars that had been set up throughout the land that was used to worship other gods. The sanctuaries of Israel is an interesting term. Israel built some alternative places of worship. One of them is in Bethel, the other is in Dan, and these became kind of centers of defiance because the nations to the north, the tribes to the north, didn't want their people to go south to Jerusalem to worship. The king didn't want to, anyways. So I'm going to turn back. I'm going to read first in Deuteronomy chapter 12. This kind of sets up this idea of some high places, the false places, false pagan worship, and then the other one is alternative places to worship Yahweh. So it says in Deuteronomy 12, these are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess as long as you live in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in fire, cut down their idols, and wipe out their names from those places. So it's pretty aggressive here. Completely destroy these false places of worship. Then in First Kings, it tells us in chapter 12 that Jeroboam did not like the idea of the people from the northern tribes traveling all the way down to Jerusalem. So in verse 25, it says this, then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And from there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord, Rehoboam, the king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Notice what they are. Golden calves. That's what Moses saw when he came down from Mount Sinai at the bottom of the mountain. Then it says, one he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Then I'm going to go on here because it then says what he subsequently does. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. And so now he's kind of reinstituting some of these other religious ceremonies. So the house of Jeroboam is his royal dynasty. And he obviously wants to secure and safeguard his position. And he's afraid that if people go to worship Yahweh down in Jerusalem, they will throw their allegiance back to Rehoboam. So obviously, the kingdom is already split between the northern and southern tribes. There's already 2 kings that are in place. So Jeroboam here is trying to secure his place as the ruler. But this particular oracle or vision is saying all of this is going to be destroyed. The high places of Isaac, the sanctuaries that they are going to in Bethel and Dan, and I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. He will be politically successful until Assyria comes in and destroys the northern kingdom. That happens in 722 BCE. So these 3 specific areas of judgment all pertain not only to Jeroboam's reign, but some of the alternate places of worship that he had established. And those are going to come down. And they did come down, obviously, through the invasion of Assyria and taking the northern tribes captive. All right. So we've looked at 3 visions already in this chapter, and now we have an interlude. The 4th vision is interrupted by a narrative. And the narrative is a battle between Amos, this prophet who used to be a shepherd and a fig tree caretaker, against Amaziah, who is a priest, but he is a priest not down in Jerusalem. He's a priest at these false centers of worship, in particular Bethel. And what takes place here is interesting. So I'm going to read this. It's from verse 10 down to the end of the chapter. It says, Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent a message to Jeroboam, the king of Israel. Amos is raising a conspiracy against you in the very heart of Israel. The land cannot bear all his words. For this is what Amos is saying. Jeroboam will die by the sword, and Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. Then Amaziah said to Amos, Get out, you seer. Go back to the land of Judah. Remember, he's from the south, but he's prophesying in the north. Earn your bread there, and do your prophesying there. Don't prophesy anymore at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. And Amos answered Amaziah, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock, and he said, Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now then, hear the word of the Lord. You say, Do not prophesy against Israel, and stop preaching against the descendants of Isaac. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. Your wife will become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured up and divided up, and you yourself will die in a pagan country, and Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. Okay, let's kind of dissect this a little bit. So, what is Amaziah doing? So, conspiracies have always been around, or at least the threat that there is something that's a conspiracy has always been around. We are unsure whether Amos actually said that Jeroboam was going to die by the sword at this point. But Amaziah uses that as a way of gaining power in the presence of Jeroboam. And he is basically accusing Amos of treason. He is saying, hey, this guy, he is destabilizing your country by what he is preaching. And as a result, he's a threat. And, he needs to just go back where he came from. And so Amaziah is basically threatening that Amos is subverting the king's reign here, and he is suggesting he is going to be assassinated or killed by the sword. Then what we find is he accuses Amos of being a seer, seer, but Amos never said that he was a seer in the sense of being able to foretell what is coming. He says he's a prophet, but he was originally a shepherd, and it's only because God kept calling upon him to go to the people of Israel and to prophesy, and he heeds that call, and yet Amaziah is giving him a warning in verse 16. Do not prophesy against Israel. Shut your mouth, Amos. Shut your mouth. And stop preaching against the descendants of Isaac. So there's a little bit of distortion that's going on here about what Amos has said and what he hasn't said. He calls him a seer, which might be a sarcastic thing that Amaziah is doing. Get out of here, you seer. This kind of a dismissal term, derogatory in some way. And then he says, hey, earn your bread there. The only thing you're doing this for is to get money. You're a prophet for hire. Who's paying you off? What type of pact have you made? And who's funding you to come say these words? That type of thing. And then he calls it the king's sanctuary here, the king's sanctuary and the temple of his kingdom, using religious words, which is crossing over really between the secular and the religious here. The king, is he the head of the sanctuary? I thought the priests were to be in the sanctuary. And why are they calling his kingdom a temple, for heaven's sakes? You see, he's using religious terminology there. Um, and I, Amos is trying to draw attention to the fact that there has been deep compromise among the northern tribes. They have set up an alternative kind of religious entity and structure. And they are not the true center of worship. Jerusalem is, and the priesthood in Jerusalem is to perform the sacrifices and so forth. Then Amos gets aggressive here after he has clarified his calling as a prophet. And he is a rural working class kind of guy who goes into the presence of power and warns them. And boy, does he use some words here. Take a look at this here. Your wife shall be a prostitute. Again, the word wife here is not a singular wife of the king. It's kind of a collective idea of all the people. Your people, they're a prostitute in the city. Your sons and daughters, they are going to experience this judgment that God is going to allow to come. And when this foreign power comes in, your land is going to be divided up. And all those things that are part of the inheritance that people live for, to have their land and their treasures handed down to the next generation, all of that is going to be taken away. And you are going to die, and you're going to die in a foreign land, an unclean land, in the sense of being outside the promised land. And then finally, he clarifies that Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. And that's exactly what happens. The 10 tribes, after Assyria comes in and conquers them, they never go back as a people group into their land. They intermarry. Uh, Certainly, some of them stayed in the land that God had given, but many had gone back into Assyria. There is kind of a crisscrossing of the line of the northern tribes, and that's kind of where the Samaritans kind of come into play, kind of a crossbreed between different nationalities and that type of thing. So, three visions, and then this narrative parentheses, and then one more vision that we'll look at tonight here. And that's in chapter 8. And in chapter 8, this vision is a vision of a basket full of ripe fruit. So it says in verse 1, this is what the sovereign Lord showed me, a basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. And then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. And in that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple will turn to wailing, many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. Um, the takeaway in this vision is mushy, overripe fruit that's not worth eating, but just to be thrown away. I think we've all held on to things in the refrigerator too long, where it's become mushy, soft, even moldy in some cases. Now, notice there's no intercession here by Amos, just like the plumb line. No intercession, no relenting from the judgment. And the object, obviously, here is agricultural, which is very fitting to Amos's vocation. But basically, the image is pretty easy to understand. The fruit is starting to rot, and now it's time to throw it away. So, three visions prior to the narrative and then one following it. So what do we do with this? Well, the last one really becomes provocative. In the temple, the songs of praise are going to turn to weeping, and the songs will turn to wailing. And then finally, the vision of many bodies flung out over the field who have been killed by the invasion of the Assyrians. They are not given proper burial. This is just death everywhere. And it ultimately is the idea of catastrophic national collapse. They will never recover from this. And silence is the last word. Don't try to intervene. Don't, no intercession. The time has come. So God ran out of patience with the northern tribes and he allows the other nations to come in and to invade them. So this is the way you can look at it. You have in your notes there kind of a chart that summarizes what we've covered tonight. And it's just a visual: locust devouring a second crop, consuming fire, plumb line, the confrontation between Amaziah and Amos, and the basket of summer fruit. You can see here on the screen the first two. Amos intercedes. In the third and fourth, there's no intercession. Amos in his confrontation with Amaziah will defend his calling to proclaim these oracles of judgment. God changes his mind in the first two, but not in the last two visions. And then the message basically there: mercy in the midst of judgment, but Israel continues to fail the test of being uh, uh, poor covenant partners with God. And ultimately, what he had warned all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy eventually comes true within their history. So that will then turn the people to wailing and dealing with massive amounts of loss of life. And then the last word, silence. Chapter 8 is going to go after verse 3 in a different direction. And that's why I'm going to stop that here, because the last two chapters of Amos uh, is kind of the last words of why God is so angry with the people. And that is primarily because of the way they are mistreating the poor and the injustice that is taking place within the land. But we'll come to that next week. So we are going to stop our recording at this point and stop the share. And we'll see if you have any thoughts tonight that you want to